The year was 1872, a year that history remembers for its industrial growth, for its promise of a new America, and for the trembling footsteps of a country still haunted by the shadow of the Civil War. But beneath the records of factories, railroads, and speeches of progress, there lingered whispers, too dark for the church pews and too blasphemous for the newspapers to print. These whispers came in the form of song, murder ballads, sung not in the open air of festivals, but in hushed tones by those who claimed to have witnessed things that should never have been. And among these ballads, there were 4 that never reached the hymn books. 4 so grotesque that even the ministers who heard them swore to bury their memory beneath silence. They were called the Forgotten Murder Ballads of 1872. I want you to imagine a small town tucked away in the backwoods of Tennessee, a place that maps barely recognized and trains never touched. The town was called Willow Marsh, though by the time the 20th century rolled around, it was already wiped clean from records. Travelers swore the land there was cursed. The marshland around it was heavy with fog, and the wooden homes leaned inward, as though the soil itself was trying to drag them down. At the center stood a church, whitewashed once, but by 1872 its wood had warped black with rot. The locals called it St. Uriel's, though it was said no angel ever set foot there. And it was within this church that the first of those ballads was born. On the evening of May 14, 1872, the church bell rang 3 times, though no one pulled its rope. Families hurried to the chapel, thinking a service had been called, but what they found was not a sermon. Instead, a woman named Lydia Crane stood in the pulpit, her dress still damp from the marsh, her hair clinging to her face as though she had risen from the grave. She sang, not words of scripture, but a ballad, low, mournful, and soaked with grief. Her voice shook as though it carried the weight of confession. She sang of her husband's hand upon her throat, of a child buried alive beneath the boards of their cabin, and of blood soaking into the swamp, staining it forever. "Bury me shallow," her refrain went, "so the crows may carry me whole." When she finished, the church was silent. Men trembled, women sobbed, and no one dared to move. The next morning, Lydia was gone, and no one in Willow Marsh ever saw her again. But her song spread. Children hummed it in the fields, workers muttered it under their breath, and by midsummer, the ballad was known across 3 counties. The first of the forgotten songs had been born. But why, you might ask, would a woman confess such horrors in song? And why did the church itself not denounce her? Because Willow Marsh was not like other towns. There was a society there, one older than the Civil War, older even than the church itself. They called themselves the Congregation of the Last Light, a brotherhood who believed that sin could only be purged not by prayer, but by exposure. They believed confession was meaningless unless sung aloud, bared to the marrow of the community. And so they welcomed Lydia's ballad, not as madness, but as ritual. They wrote it down in their black hymnals, copied by candlelight, and hid those pages beneath the altar of St. Uriel's. The ministers, the very ones entrusted with the salvation of their people, were the keepers of these ballads. What history remembers as song was, for them, scripture. You may think these are the exaggerations of folklore, the sort of story passed from tongue to tongue until it grew monstrous. But records, faded, water-stained records locked away in county archives, still speak of Willow Marsh. There are mentions of the church, of its sermons ending at midnight, of strange songs replacing prayers. A letter from a traveling preacher, dated July 1872, describes a gathering of faces hollow as skulls, singing murder in unison, their eyes fixed not upon the cross, but upon each other, as though the very act of song was worship. He left the town before nightfall, vowing never to return. The letter ends with one chilling line: "The air there tastes of blood, and the ground moans when you walk upon it." The first ballad, Lydia's Confession, might have been dismissed as madness, were it not for the second. The second emerged not from a grieving woman, but from the lips of children. It was October of that same year, when schoolboys were heard chanting a rhyme by the well at the edge of the marsh. The rhyme spoke of a farmer named Jonah Hale, who dragged his neighbors into his barn and hung them like livestock. The children sang of ropes creaking, of screams muffled by burlap, and of a fire that burned not wood but bone. Their voices were sing-song, innocent, yet the words were dripping with brutality. When asked who taught them, they answered, "The marsh." Some said they had found a small scrap of paper wedged between the stones of the well, the words written in ink that bled when touched. The schoolteacher burned it, but the song did not die. It spread, as if the melody itself had taken root in their minds. Adults began to hear it in their sleep, whistling from the trees, echoing from the fields. And then, in November, Jonah Hale himself disappeared. His farm was found abandoned, his animals starved, and in the ashes of his hearth, the neighbors found rope, charred but unbroken. The second ballad had taken its offering. It was at this point the church records fall silent. There are no sermons logged after November 1872, no marriages, no burials, nothing. It was as if St. Uriel's closed its doors to God and opened them to something else. The ministers themselves stopped writing letters, their correspondence drying up in the archives. All that remains of that winter are the ballads themselves, recorded in fragments by outsiders who claimed to have heard them carried on the wind. The third song and the fourth would come before the year ended. And it is in these songs that the true horror of Willow Marsh and the congregation of the Last Light reveals itself. But to understand the weight of these ballads, to feel their grip upon your throat as the people of 1872 did, you must step back and remember the world in which they lived. America was fractured, its soil still bleeding from the war between North and South. Poverty festered in the countryside, where widows raised children in cabins with dirt floors, and veterans stumbled drunk through the fields. Religion promised comfort, but the church had become splintered, each preacher louder than the last, each town building its own chapel. In such a world, faith was not always about salvation. Sometimes it was about control. Sometimes it was about binding people together, not with hope, but with fear. The congregation of the Last Light understood this. They understood that a community bound by shared horror is stronger than one bound by hope. And so they made their hymns not of praise, but of murder. They turned confessions into scripture, and scripture into ritual. The people of Willow Marsh sang because they believed that in singing, they made themselves clean. But the songs did not cleanse. They infected. Even now, a century and a half later, fragments of these ballads survive. An archivist in Nashville claimed in 1928 to have uncovered a hymn book from Willow Marsh, its pages brittle, its ink almost gone. He published only a single verse before the book vanished again, this time into private hands. The verse read, "He fed us blood, and we drank it whole. We sang his name until we were nothing but his shadow." Who the he was remains unknown, though some scholars have speculated it refers to a leader within the congregation, a figure who never signed his name, but whose presence is felt in each song, like a conductor behind the choir. Others believe it was the marsh itself, personified, given voice by those who dwelled too long in its fog. Whatever the truth, the ballads endure. And as we begin to unearth them, one by one, you will see why even the church refused to speak their names aloud. This is the story of the forgotten murder ballads of 1872, songs too grim for the pews, too cursed for the hymnals, and yet too powerful to ever die. Tonight we will unearth the four of them, piece by piece, and with them, the truth of Willow Marsh and the congregation of the Last Light. If you listen closely, you may even hear the faint echo of their refrain, carried still on the wind, waiting for a new voice to sing it again. The winter of 1872 was harsher than most in Tennessee. The marshlands froze at night, their waters turning to glassy sheets that cracked under the weight of boots. Families shuttered their homes, burning what little wood they had. And yet within the walls of St. Uriel's, there was heat, candle flames flickering like restless spirits, smoke thick with incense, and voices raised not in prayer but in something older, something more primal. Witnesses who later passed through Willow Marsh claimed that even on the coldest nights, when the town should have slept in silence, the church glowed faintly from within, as though a furnace had been lit at its heart. From a distance they swore they could hear singing. It was not joyful, it was not worship, it was a dirge, and within that dirge, the third ballad was born. The story of the third ballad begins with a man named Reverend Silas Crow. On the surface, he was the shepherd of Willow Marsh, a preacher, who had taken up his post in 1869, just 4 years after the war. He was tall, with a voice that could split the rafters, and eyes so dark they seemed to drink the light around him. To outsiders, he preached redemption, urging his flock to lay down their burdens and trust in divine will. But to those within, Willow Marsh, to the secret congregation that gathered after the bell tolled midnight, he preached something else entirely. He spoke of light not as salvation, but as the last flame before eternal darkness. He told them the marsh had always been a graveyard, long before men built homes upon it, and that the dead there did not rest. They listened. He urged his people to confess their worst sins, not to God, but to the ground itself, to feed the soil with truth so that the marsh might spare them. He said the earth was hungry, and if they did not sing to it, it would take what it wished. It was under his watch that the third ballad emerged. December 19, 1872. A child, a girl no older than 10, stood at the front of St. Uriel's during the midnight gathering. She wore a wool dress too thin for the season, and her hair hung in knots. Her name, according to scattered records, was Mary Beth Candler. She was the daughter of a farmer who had lost his wife to fever the year before. The congregation described her as pale, with lips that quivered even before she spoke. Reverend Crow placed his hand upon her shoulder and told the gathered townsfolk that she had a song to give them. No one asked why. No one questioned. She opened her mouth, and what came out was not the faltering voice of a child, but a melody, slow and deliberate, each word sinking like a stone in water. She sang of a well, deep and black, where children were lowered by rope. She sang of cries echoing against the stone, of water closing over heads, of small hands clawing at the walls. Her refrain repeated only one phrase: "The well remembers." The congregation wept. Some wailed, clutching their faces. Others trembled so violently their knees buckled beneath them. Yet none moved to silence her. When she finished, Reverend Crow bent down, kissed the crown of her head, and whispered, "You have fed the ground, child." Mary Beth was not seen again after that night. Her father claimed she had gone to live with kin in another county, but no records exist of her ever leaving Willow Marsh. The well she sang of still stood at the edge of town, the same one where schoolboys had once found a scrap of song. And though the town used its water daily after that night, few dared to draw from it after dark. They said when the rope uncoiled, it sometimes came back wet with more than water. The third ballad did not remain within Willow Marsh. A traveling peddler passing through the county in January claimed to have heard the melody drifting across the marsh as he camped by the roadside. He remembered it so vividly he hummed it years later when recounting his journey, his face pale, his eyes unfocused, as though haunted still by its weight. That memory was transcribed into a county ledger, tucked between trade notes and tax disputes, an accidental preservation of something meant to be forgotten. "The well remembers," he repeated, shaking his head. "It remembers." By this point, whispers of Willow Marsh began to reach neighboring towns. Ministers warned their congregations not to wander into the marsh. Parents told their children to cover their ears should they hear strange songs. But still, curiosity drew some in. A schoolteacher from Greenville, seeking to understand the stories, traveled to Willow Marsh in February 1873. He kept a journal of his visit, describing the town as hollowed, as though every house had been built for the dead and the living were only borrowing space. He attended a Sunday sermon at St. Uriel's, expecting to find a simple, struggling parish. What he witnessed instead left him shaken beyond words. His journal reads, "They sang, every one of them sang, but not hymns I recognized. The children knew them best of all, their voices rising above the others. These were not psalms, but tales of murder, death, and blood. They sang them as though their souls depended on it. I felt my chest tighten, as though I were being bound by the very air." The schoolteacher left the next morning, abandoning his belongings, and was never heard from again. His journal, however, was found lodged between the boards of a wagon left in Greenville, the last trace of his existence. It was in the dead of that same winter that the fourth and final ballad was sung. Unlike the others, this one was not birthed within the walls of St. Uriel's. It came from the marsh itself. March 1873. A great thaw melted the frozen waters, flooding the fields and sweeping away fences and tools. Families were stranded, their homes isolated by water thick with silt and debris. It was then, at night, that they heard it, the fourth ballad carried on the wind. Entire households claimed the song surrounded them, circling their cabins like wolves. It was low, guttural, more chant than melody, and though no words could be made out clearly, all agreed it spoke of the earth opening, of bodies rising, of a hunger that could not be sated. Those who heard it were left shaken, some unable to sleep, others refusing to eat. They said the marsh had sung back. The land itself had joined their congregation. Reverend Crowe declared this the final revelation. He told his people the marsh had accepted their offerings, that their songs had reached the soil, and that they were now bound forever to its memory. But the binding was not a blessing. Within weeks, 3 families vanished, their homes abandoned, doors left open, belongings untouched. Tracks led into the marsh and ended where the water grew too deep to follow. It was said the ballads had claimed them, drawn them into the ground they had fed. By summer, Willow Marsh was all but empty. Only the church stood, and even that sagged into the earth, its steeple tilting like a broken finger pointing at the sky. The 4 ballads, once sung with trembling lips and hollow voices, became whispers. Outsiders avoided the marsh, maps erased, the name. And yet the songs never fully died. They surfaced in fragments, in odd places. A verse scrawled in the margin of a hymn book in Kentucky, a refrain remembered by an old man in Georgia, a lullaby hummed by a woman in a Louisiana asylum. Always the same melodies, always the same words. The well remembers. Bury me, shallow. The marsh is hungry. The forgotten murder ballads of 1872 had scattered like seeds, rooting themselves in minds and voices across the South. To this day, no complete collection of the 4 exists. Only fragments, hints, pieces gathered by scholars and folklorists who often abandon their studies before finishing. They say the ballads are cursed, that the more you collect, the closer the marsh comes, as though the ground itself has ears, listening for its song to be sung once more in full. Those who chase the memory of Willow Marsh rarely return whole. The story of the forgotten murder ballads of 1872 should have ended in the ruins of Willow Marsh, swallowed by mud and silence. But history has a way of dragging what we try to bury back into the light, and in the case of these songs, the earth seemed unwilling to let them rest. The ballads began to travel, not as whole pieces, but as fragments, drifting like smoke, appearing where they did not belong, and leaving behind unease wherever they surfaced. In 1875, just 3 years after Willow Marsh had collapsed into memory, a Methodist minister in Asheville, North Carolina, wrote a peculiar letter to his superior. He described children in his parish singing a strange verse while playing near the cemetery. They skipped rope and clapped their hands in rhythm, but the words were not of games. Bury me shallow, bury me cold, let the blackbirds carry my soul. The minister thought it was some crude invention, perhaps a childish misinterpretation of scripture, until he realized the melody itself was nothing like a hymn. It was slow, dragging, its cadence far too heavy for play. He confronted the children, asking where they had learned it. Their answer was the same one given in Willow Marsh 3 years earlier. They shrugged and said, "The ground told us." The letter survives, tucked inside the Asheville church archives, though the minister's name is blurred by age. His fate is not documented, but the fact that he recorded the rhyme at all shows how far the contagion of song had already spread. The ballads were moving, unchained from their birthplace, whispered by children who had never set foot in Tennessee, as though the earth itself had become their choir. By 1878, Folklorists traveling through the Appalachians began to record odd snatches of verse, usually from the lips of the elderly. One ballad fragment collected in rural Virginia reads, "The well remembers, the rope runs red, the ground takes the living and feeds the dead." The collector, a man named Horace Melton, published the verse in a slim volume of mountain songs. He included no explanation of its origin, only noting it was sung by an old woman whose eyes seemed never to close, even in the dark. Melton died the following year, his body found face down in a river with no signs of struggle. His book went out of print, but the verse lingered in regional folklore, disguised as just another Appalachian chant. Yet those who sang it often complained of nightmares, of waking to the sound of water dripping from their ceilings, though no leak could be found. The church did its best to suppress these fragments. Ministers warned against devil's rhymes, urging families to burn any scrap of paper bearing them. Some towns even held bonfires, casting hymnals and journals into the flames if they bore so much as a line resembling the ballads. But suppression only seemed to feed their endurance. The more the church denounced them, the more children repeated them, as if defiance gave the songs strength. It was as though the ballads thrived not in reverence, but in rebellion. By the 1880s, stories began to circulate of people who tried to reconstruct the ballads in full. One of the earliest was a schoolteacher named Jonathan Sykes in Kentucky. Fascinated by the eerie fragments his students chanted on the playground, he began compiling verses, piecing them together into what he believed were coherent songs. He wrote to colleagues in Virginia and Tennessee, asking if they had heard similar lines. Letters survive in county archives, bearing transcriptions in his careful hand. The marsh is hungry, the marsh is wide. It takes the truth we try to hide. In his notes, he claimed he was close to restoring the first ballad, the one attributed to Lydia Crane in 1872. But before he could finish, Jonathan vanished. His classroom was left in perfect order, chalk still fresh on the board, his papers scattered across his desk. The only clue was a line written over and over again in his handwriting. "The well remembers." His disappearance was never solved. Some whispered that he had gone to Tennessee to seek the marsh itself. Others swore the marsh had come to him. And yet Jonathan Sykes was not the last. Over the decades, others have tried to collect the fragments, each convinced they could tame the songs by setting them in order. In 1901, a folklorist named Eliza Gentry published a short pamphlet titled "The Murder Ballads of Willow Marsh." It was the first printed attempt to tie the songs to their alleged origin in Tennessee. The pamphlet included 3 verses, though Eliza admitted the 4th remained unspeakable. Within weeks of its release, every copy vanished. Bookshops claimed men in black coats purchased them in bulk, paying in cash and leaving no names. Eliza herself was admitted to an asylum in Virginia, where she lived out her days drawing images of wells over and over, until her death in 1914. Not a single copy of her pamphlet is known to survive. Only references to it remain, hints of something that once existed, but was carefully erased. There is something parasitic about the ballads, something that resists containment. Those who study them too closely find themselves haunted, pulled into silence, erased from the margins of history, as surely as Willow Marsh itself was erased. Perhaps that is why the church never spoke of them, why they buried the memory beneath sermons of light and salvation. Perhaps they knew the songs were not simply words, but vessels. A kind of scripture that, once complete, binds not the soul to heaven, but the living to the soil. But the songs persisted, resurfacing in unexpected ways. In 1928, a Nashville archivist named Thomas Rourke claimed to have uncovered one of the original hymnals from St. Uriel's itself. The book, according to his notes, was brittle, its spine cracked, its ink faded into brown stains. He transcribed only a single line before the hymnal disappeared once again. "We sang his name until we were nothing but his shadow." Rourke never published the rest. He drowned the following year in a boating accident, though no one who knew him believed it was an accident at all. His body was never recovered. His widow claimed he had become obsessed with a voice he heard at night, whispering from the floorboards, urging him to finish the song. To this day, only fragments remain. Scholars have compiled lists, each one slightly different, yet always circling the same phrases. Bury me shallow, the well remembers, the marsh is hungry. We sang his name. The repetition across states, across decades, suggests something more than coincidence. It suggests endurance, a kind of infection that never truly dies, only waits for a new host. And here is where the question deepens. Were the ballads simply folklore, born of superstition in a time of poverty and despair? Or were they something else entirely? The people of Willow Marsh believed the songs had power. That confession and melody fed the ground and spared them from its hunger. But what if the songs were not confession at all? What if they were offerings? What if every time a verse was sung, it was not the singer who was unburdened, but the soil that was fed? It is tempting to dismiss the ballads as myth, the fever, dream of a forgotten town, but they resurface too often, too consistently, in places far removed from one another. Like a melody carried on the wind, they return when least expected. Farmers in Georgia have sworn to hear them in the cry of owls. Coal miners in West Virginia claim to hear refrains echoing down shafts, as though the earth itself hummed with memory. In the Mississippi Delta, a blues musician in the 1930s admitted his most haunting song came not from inspiration, but from a dream, where a child's voice whispered, "The well remembers." By the early 20th century, the ballads had taken on a new form. No longer confined to hymnals or whispered confessionals, they slipped into music, into folk traditions, even into lullabies. They disguised themselves, waiting, because that is their true nature. They are not merely history, they are persistence. They are hunger disguised as song, and those who hear them do not forget. Which brings us to the present day. Fragments of these ballads still survive, tucked away in basements, hidden in private collections, muttered by the oldest of voices on their deathbeds. Yet even fragments are dangerous, because once you hear them, truly hear them, they do not leave. They linger, they echo, and somewhere beneath the ground, the marsh listens, waiting for the songs to be sung in full once again. If the ballads were only the product of grief-stricken townsfolk, we might dismiss them as tragic folklore. But every whisper, every scattered document, points back to the same hidden hand. The congregation of the last light. They were not a church in the sense we understand it. They had no written doctrine, no scripture beyond the ballads themselves, and no structure save the voice of one man, Reverend Silas Crow. Crow remains a ghost in history. He appears in no seminary records, no ordination lists. His name survives only in fragments. A scrawled signature on a marriage certificate in 1870, a fleeting mention in a county tax book, and a single photograph so degraded it is impossible to tell whether the eyes staring from the black and white smudge belonged to a man at all. Yet his influence was absolute. Witnesses describe him as a man who spoke little outside the pulpit, yet when he raised his voice, even the marsh seemed to fall silent. His sermons, if they could be called that, did not promise heaven, nor warn of hell. He spoke instead of the earth, the soil beneath their feet, as a living ledger that recorded every hidden crime. The ground, he said, was both judge and jury. To conceal one's sins was to invite the marsh to rise and devour. To confess them in song was to bind them to the soil and be spared. Crow's words struck something deep in the people of Willow Marsh. Many had lived through the war, had buried brothers and fathers in shallow graves. They knew the earth swallowed blood that it did not forget. To them, his message was not madness. It was recognition. He gave them a way to believe their suffering had meaning, that the land's hunger could be bargained with if only they sang. In that bargain, the ballads were born. But who was Crow? Some say he was once a Union chaplain who deserted after witnessing atrocities too great to reconcile with faith. Others believe he was a Confederate preacher who lost everything when the South fell and sought power in darker places. Still others whisper he was never a man of the cloth at all, but a drifter who found in Willow Marsh a people desperate enough to believe anything. The truth is buried, like so much of this story, in gaps and shadows. But whatever his origins, Crow understood the potency of ritual. He turned murder into liturgy, confession into chorus, and bound a whole community in a covenant not with God but with the soil beneath their feet. It is said Crow kept a book, not a Bible, but a ledger bound in black leather. Parishioners claimed he wrote in it every night by candlelight, recording not scripture but verses of the ballads as they emerged from his flock. That ledger, if it exists, has never been found. But in 1892, a farmer in North Carolina claimed to discover a leather-bound volume buried beneath the floorboards of an abandoned cabin. The book, he said, contained nothing but lyrics, written in a hand both elegant and uneven, as if the ink itself trembled. He turned it over to a local minister, who burned it within the hour. The minister later confessed on his deathbed that he had not destroyed the whole book. He had kept one page, pressed flat beneath his mattress until the day he died. His grandson found it decades later, brittle and yellow, the words barely legible. We sang him into the ground, and the ground sang back. The grandson burned it too. Yet even his testimony, passed down orally, was enough to preserve the verse. The more one searches for Crow, the more the lines between fact and folklore blur. Some locals claimed he could not be buried when he died, that the earth spat his body back out, refusing him. Others swore he never died at all, but dissolved into the marsh, his voice still rising in the fog. What is certain is this: when Willow Marsh emptied in 1873, Crow disappeared with it. No grave marks his name, no obituary mourns him, and yet, wherever the ballads resurface, his shadow lingers. The congregation of the last light did not die with Willow Marsh. Like the ballads themselves, they scattered. There are reports of similar gatherings in the decades that followed. In 1887, a community outside Lexington, Kentucky was found abandoned, its homes left open, meals half-eaten on tables. On the wall of the town's chapel, written in what appeared to be soot, were the words, "The well remembers." In 1903, police raided a farmhouse in rural Arkansas after neighbors reported strange singing at night. They found a group of families gathered in the basement, seated in a circle, chanting verses about a marsh they had never seen. The children sang the loudest. No charges were pressed. The families were released, and within a year, they had vanished. It is easy to dismiss these stories as hysteria, the product of a rural people too steeped in superstition. But the pattern is undeniable. Wherever the ballads appear, disappearance follows. Communities fracture, families vanish, and always the songs remain. What made them so dangerous? Perhaps it was not the words themselves, but the act of singing. Confession alone is passive. To speak is to unburden. But to sing, to pour breath into melody, is to animate. It gives life. It carries beyond walls, beyond towns, across fields and rivers. Singing makes memory contagious. That was the genius of Crow's congregation. He knew that by binding their sins to song, he was not silencing them, but planting them, scattering them like seeds across generations. The ballads are not relics. They are living things, rooted in memory, fed by every voice that dares to repeat them. There are whispers that Crow himself did not invent the practice. Some folklorists believe he drew upon older traditions, remnants of European cults that used song as a vessel for sacrifice. In Scotland, there are records of murder songs chanted at wakes, confessions sung aloud to tether the dead to the grave. In Ireland, keening women would wail verses not found in scripture, lamentations that often carried dark secrets of the departed. Perhaps Crow knew of these customs, or perhaps the land itself suggested them to him. After all, the soil of America was already thick with blood by 1872. Native, enslaved, soldier, all buried shallow, all restless. Crow may simply have given voice to what was already there, what the marsh itself demanded. But whatever its origin, the congregation of the Last Light was unlike any other sect of its time. It was not a church, not a cult in the sense we think of today. It was something more insidious. It was a binding, a pact between man and earth, written not in ink but in melody. The ballads were their scripture, their ritual, their legacy. And though the congregation vanished, the songs endure. The chilling part is this: fragments still appear. Even in the modern day, folklorists record traces of the ballads in rural lullabies, in prison work songs, even in fragments whispered by those who cannot explain where they learned them. The marsh is gone, buried beneath decades of silt and silence, yet the congregation's legacy remains, scattered and waiting. Because that was Crow's true vision. He did not want a church of stone. He wanted a church of voices, eternal and portable, carried by anyone who dared to sing. And that is why the ballads were too grim for the church records. Because the ministers who first heard them knew what they were not meant to be. They were not confessions, not folklore, not warnings. They were seeds. And seeds grow even in darkness, especially in darkness. Which brings us back to the question that has haunted every scholar, every folklorist, every witness who ever brushed against the forgotten murder ballads. What happens when someone sings them all together? What happens when the 4 songs, born in Willow Marsh in 1872, are restored in full and given breath again? The answer, perhaps, is why history has worked so hard to erase them, and why, even now, the marsh still waits in silence, listening for its song to return. The turn of the century should have buried Willow Marsh in silence. The railroad came. The towns grew. The country shifted its gaze toward steel and industry. Yet the ballads refused to stay forgotten. They lingered in corners, drifting like smoke. And every time they surfaced, something or someone seemed to wither. In 1911, a folklorist named Jonathan Weaver, working out of Ohio State University, began cataloging what he called orphaned laments, songs passed down without attribution. Fragments of verses carried through generations of families who had no memory of their origin. Weaver's notebooks, which survive in the university archives, contain eerie sketches of lines that echo the Willow Marsh ballads almost word for word. One verse reads, "The well is full, the bucket red, we drink until we dream the dead." Another, "I bound her with the river reeds, I sang until the water closed." Weaver did not know what he had stumbled onto. He thought these were rural exaggerations, grotesque nursery rhymes perhaps descended from European traditions. Yet in his private letters, unearthed only after his death in 1919, he confessed to something far more unsettling. He wrote of nights when the songs would not leave him, when his mind replayed the melodies without pause, a ceaseless humming that grew louder as he transcribed. His final letter to his wife, dated September 3, 1919, contained only one sentence. "If I write the 4th verse, I will not wake tomorrow." He died that night. His death was ruled a stroke. His widow, however, insisted she found him with ink still wet on the page. Not words, but musical notation. The notes trailed off, unfinished, as though Weaver's hand had been seized mid-measure. That final scrap vanished after his funeral. Some claim his widow burned it. Others whisper it was stolen by one of his students. No one knows for sure. Weaver was not the only one to stumble into the echo of Willow Marsh. In 1926, a prison warden in Louisiana reported that a group of inmates had taken to singing at night, weaving verses about blood and water into their chain gang chants. The guards dismissed it as nonsense, until the warden himself entered the yard one evening and heard them. The song was not joyous, it was not defiant. It was dirge-like, a steady rhythm of call and response that chilled him to the bone. He ordered the men separated, forbidden from singing. Within a week, 3 of them were dead, 2 from fighting, 1 by hanging himself with his own bedding. The warden refused to speak of it again, but one surviving guard recorded the refrain. He claimed he heard echoing in the yard. "Stone cannot hide, the soil will know. We dig for him, we dig below." By the 1930s, the ballads had become something folklorists whispered of but never published. The Library of Congress sent field recordists into the Deep South, capturing everything from blues to work chants. But when confronted with the fragments of the ballads, they turned the reels off. One archivist later confessed that a recording existed, a single wax cylinder containing what may have been the second ballad in its entirety, sung by an elderly woman in Arkansas who claimed her grandmother learned it in a drowned town. The cylinder, he said, was destroyed intentionally. He admitted this in an interview decades later. "I've cataloged murder songs before. They are grim, yes, but they end with justice. This one didn't. It wasn't about God or law or punishment. It was about feeding something. I won't say more." He died 2 weeks later, struck by a car. And so, the songs remained half-remembered things, scraps buried in archives, whispered in cellars, hummed by those who never understood what they carried. Each fragment told the same story: confession to murder, bound not to forgiveness but to repetition. The act of singing was the absolution. The act of remembering was the curse. Yet, as the 20th century advanced, there were always those who wanted to piece the whole together. It was in 1954 when a man named Reverend Allen Thorne, an amateur historian and minister in Virginia, set himself to the task of reconstructing the complete ballads. Thorne believed that uncovering these songs could serve as a lesson in the dangers of sin. He scoured archives, interviewed aging families, even traveled to Louisiana to speak with former inmates who remembered fragments from the prison yard. His letters show he believed he had assembled 3 of the 4 ballads in full, but then came the 4th. His diary, now preserved in the Library of Virginia, ends abruptly on July 17, 1956. The final entry reads, "Tonight I will sing it, not as they did, but as a warning. The people must hear, they must know what horror these verses carry. I will not give them silence." Thorne was found the next morning in his study. His wife said his lips were blue, though there was no sign of struggle, no wound. The diary lay open beside him, ink smudged by sweat or tears. What's chilling is that every page after the final entry had been torn out and burned in the fireplace. All except one scrap, half-charred, still legible enough to read. "The marsh is not gone. It waits in the wells, the roots, the cracks in the floor, and it listens when we sing." Historians argue about Thorne to this day. Some say he was delusional, driven to madness by superstition. Others claim he was silenced, not by death, but by something darker, something that required his silence. What cannot be denied is this: Thorne's work vanished, his transcripts, his recordings, his letters, gone. Only the diary survives, and even it is mutilated, its most important pages burned. It is as if history itself conspired to keep the ballads incomplete, but they never fully disappeared. Even in the modern era, they slip through. In the 1970s, a group of college students in Tennessee recorded themselves singing what they believed to be authentic frontier ballads for a dormitory project. When the tape resurfaced years later, archivists recognized a verse nearly identical to Weaver's notes from 1919. The tape was never digitized. It was placed in restricted storage, inaccessible to the public. One professor who heard it wrote a note in the margin of the archive catalog: "Do not play alone." And so the ballads haunt the periphery of American memory, like shadows that move at the edge of candlelight. They appear, they vanish, they resurface in voices that cannot explain their origin. Always fractured, never whole. As if the 4th ballad is too heavy to bear, too dangerous to remember in full. But here lies the question that chills every scholar who has traced these fragments. Is it history that buries them, or is it the songs themselves? Is there some quality in them, some infection carried in melody, that demands silence? Were the ministers of Willow Marsh right to keep them from the record books? Were the archivists right to burn the cylinders, to shred the pages, to leave gaps where the verses should be? Because every time the ballad's near completion, tragedy follows. A man dies at his desk, pen in hand. Prisoners hang themselves after singing. Archivists destroy their own collections. Families vanish. Communities fracture. And always the marsh seems closer, as if it breathes through the gaps, waiting for someone to sing it whole again. The forgotten murder ballads of 1872 are more than relics of grief. They are something alive, something that moves between generations like a parasite, hiding in melody, waiting in silence. And though historians may argue, though folklorists may debate, one truth is certain: they have not gone away. They are waiting. The 20th century gave the ballads new soil. By then, America had grown louder, its faith in old superstitions fading under neon signs and radios. But darkness has a way of adapting, finding cracks in the modern facade. And the ballads, too grim for the church, too elusive for the archives, found their way into a new home, the underground. The earliest whispers came in the late 1960s, at the height of the folk revival. Young musicians scoured Appalachia and the Deep South for forgotten songs, eager to resurrect America's haunted past. In 1967, a duo calling themselves the Hollow Pines recorded a demo tape in a basement studio in Kentucky. One track, listed simply as Ballad No. 3, was unlike the others. The verses were jagged, repetitive, unsettling. Instead of telling a story of love or loss, it spoke of a woman bound by river reeds, her body sinking beneath dark water as voices rose around her. The recording was never released. Days after it was cut, the master tape was stolen, and the duo disbanded without explanation. One of the musicians interviewed years later would only say, "We didn't write that song. We don't know where it came from, but when we played it back, it didn't sound like us." By the 1970s, the ballads had seeped into urban folklore. In Detroit, a group of experimental musicians incorporated fragments of the songs into what they described as anti-hymns. Their live shows became notorious for sudden power outages, equipment failures, and audience members collapsing in fainting fits. The band's final performance in 1975 ended when a fire broke out on stage. No one died, but the footage, recovered years later, shows something eerie. The moment the lights flickered out, the band continued to play. Only their silhouettes were visible, but their mouths were open wide, singing, long after the instruments fell silent. Occult groups, too, began circling the ballads. In the 1980s, a fringe society calling themselves the Order of Last Light surfaced in rural Pennsylvania. They claimed to be the inheritors of Reverend Silas Crow's teachings, though their origins were murky. Police reports from 1984 describe raids on abandoned farmhouses where ritual circles had been drawn on the floor. Candles melted into the dirt. At the center of one room lay a crude wooden lectern with a single sheet of paper. Written on it was a verse eerily familiar to folklorists. "The well remembers, the earth recalls. Sing low, sing loud, until it takes us all." The order vanished as suddenly as it appeared. Some say they splintered. Others say they succeeded in what they sought. What remains are scattered reports of chanting heard at night in the valleys of Pennsylvania. Voices carrying melodies one can quite place. But the most chilling revival attempt came at the turn of the millennium. In 1999, a graduate student named Evelyn Cross at the University of Chicago began her dissertation on American folk traditions of death. Cross was no mere collector of verses. She was determined to reconstruct the ballads in their entirety, believing they held clues to how rural Americans processed grief and trauma after the Civil War. Her notes, later recovered from her apartment, show she had pieced together 3 of the 4 ballads almost word for word. She held interviews with elderly families across Kentucky, Tennessee, and Louisiana, recording fragments sung by men and women who claimed they had learned them as children without knowing where from. In one tape, preserved only partially, a woman in her 80s hums a refrain while weeping. "Don't let them take me. Don't let them bind me. The marsh is not gone." Cross grew obsessed with finding the 4th ballad. Her notebooks became erratic, filled with sketches of waterlogged churches, cryptic symbols, and passages written over and over again. "It listens when we sing." On March 17, 2000, she delivered a guest lecture where she played audio of what she claimed was the 3rd ballad in full. The recording lasted less than 4 minutes. Students present described the experience as suffocating. Several left, the room in tears without understanding why. One fainted. Cross dismissed their reactions as psychosomatic. 2 weeks later, she disappeared. Her apartment was left in disarray, her research scattered, the tapes gone. Only her computer remained, with a final document on the desktop titled 4th. The file was corrupted, unopenable. No backup was ever found. Since then, Cross has become something of a myth in academic circles, the name invoked in whispers, like Weaver and Thorne before her. Those who knew her insist she was brilliant, rational, not the type to lose herself in obsession. Yet her vanishing is undeniable. Some suggest she ran from the pressure. Others believe she pieced the fourth ballad together, sang it, and never came back. In recent years, the Ballads have found yet another vessel: the internet. Amateur musicians, often unaware of what they are stumbling into, post fragments of the songs online, disguised as old folk tunes. One recording surfaced in 2014, uploaded to a small music forum. The anonymous user claimed it was a frontier hymn passed down in his family. The file lasted just 90 seconds, but within weeks, users who had downloaded it began reporting the same dream: a marsh at night, fog curling over black water, a voice just out of reach humming. The file was later removed, the user's account deleted. No trace remains except testimonies and comment threads. But the question remains: why do the Ballads refuse to vanish? Why do they return again and again in new mouths, new instruments, new technologies? Perhaps the answer lies in what Reverend Crowe said over a century ago, that the earth itself remembers. The songs are not only human creations, they are offerings, confessions bound to the soil. The land has a way of preserving what it craves, and the pattern has never broken. Each time someone edges closer to completion, tragedy follows. Weaver, Thorne, Cross, each believed they could assemble the four songs. Each was silenced before the final verse was sung. And yet fragments remain, scattered like seeds, waiting for new voices to carry them. This is the danger. The Ballads are not mere relics. They are not just songs. They are instruments of memory, vessels for grief and guilt and blood. And every time they are sung, the marsh breathes again. Imagine, then, what might happen if all four were restored. Imagine the voices rising, not in a forgotten church, not in a drowned town, but now, in a world of microphones, radios, and endless digital reach. A ballad that once echoed in a single marsh could, with one upload, ripple across the earth. Perhaps that is why history has burned the cylinders, shredded the notes, corrupted the files. Perhaps silence is the only protection. But silence is fragile. And already, too many have heard fragments. Too many have carried the melody without knowing. The marsh does not need all of us. It only needs enough. And so the question lingers, heavy and unanswered: will someone someday sing all four again? The Ballads of Willow Marsh were never meant to survive the century. They should have rotted with the drowned town, silenced with the voices that sang them. And yet here we are, more than 150 years later, still speaking of them, still hearing their fragments in places they should not be. The question is no longer whether the songs exist. It is whether they have ever truly stopped. Consider this. In 2019, a maintenance crew in rural Mississippi uncovered a well while clearing land for a new subdivision. Inside, beneath rusted buckets and moss-covered timbers, they found scraps of paper, brittle and half dissolved by water. Experts called in to examine the fragments reported something strange. Faint lines of verse, written in a hand nearly identical to the Weaver notes of 1919. One line, legible even after a century underground, read, "We sang him into the ground, and the ground sang back." No one could explain how words recorded in Ohio in 1919 could appear on a page rotting in Mississippi soil for over a century. The fragments were taken to a university archive. Within months, they were lost, misfiled, destroyed, or perhaps, as always, erased. Then there are the stories that circle the edges of local news, never breaking fully into headlines. A group of teenagers in West Virginia vanish after camping near an abandoned church. Their belongings are found, their phones still recording. The last audio clip contains faint singing in the background, layered voices rising and falling in a rhythm no one can quite identify. The recording is ruled corrupted, or the report out of Louisiana in 2021, where a pastor claims his congregation began humming a hymn during service that he did not teach them, that no hymn book contained. He swore the melody came from nowhere, yet the entire congregation sang in unison. When asked later what the hymn was, none of the parishioners could recall the words, only the feeling of singing. only the image of water rising to their knees. Coincidences, some say. Rural myths dressed as modern mysteries. But we have seen the pattern repeat too many times. Songs remembered when they should have been forgotten. Verses resurfacing in places with no connection to the marsh. Each time they echo, fragmentary, incomplete, as though the ballads themselves are searching for a voice strong enough, for a mouth willing enough to piece them whole again. And perhaps that is the real terror. Because unlike most legends, this one does not ask for belief. It only asks for repetition. The words need not be understood. They need only be sung. That is what makes them dangerous. That is what has allowed them to live so long in the cracks of memory. You do not have to worship Reverend Crow. You do not have to believe in the congregation of the last light. You need only hum a tune your grandmother once sang, a lullaby without a name, and unknowingly feed the marsh again. The soil remembers. The earth keeps its own records when the church will not. And if history has tried to bury the ballads, perhaps it is not to hide shame or superstition, but to protect us. Because every archivist, every historian, every folklorist who has brought the songs too close to the surface has suffered the same fate. Silence, weaver, thorn, cross. Their names are gravestones of memory, reminders that some things are forgotten for a reason, and yet the temptation remains. Even now, as you listen to these words, perhaps some part of you is curious. Perhaps you want to know what the full ballad sounded like. Perhaps you wonder what it would mean to sing them aloud. That is the danger. Because the ballads are not. They linger, incomplete, unfinished, waiting for a final voice. Maybe in a forgotten attic. Maybe in an archive misfiled under folk songs miscellaneous. Maybe in the humming of a child who cannot explain where the melody came from. And when all four are sung again, not in the marsh but into microphones, across radios, across the endless reach of the internet, what then? What will the soil demand in return? We cannot know. We should not know. And yet, history has a cruel way of repeating itself. So remember this. Not all songs are meant to be sung. Not all verses are meant to be restored. And if, one night, you hear a melody rising from the dark, words you do not recognize but feel, compelled to echo, resist the urge. Do not hum it. Do not whisper it. Do not carry it further than it has already traveled. Because once you do, it will not be your song anymore. It will be the marsh's, and the marsh remembers, always. Soft, heavy pause as if the narrator exhales slowly. If these stories unsettled you, if they made you question the shadows of history and the echoes that never die, then you already understand the truth behind the forgotten murder ballads of 1872. They are not just history, they are warning. And if you dare, stay with us. Subscribe for more tales buried in silence, more histories they tried to erase, more voices that should have stayed quiet. But remember, some songs do not end when the singing stops. Some songs wait.